The house had been empty for as long as anyone could remember. It sat at the very end of Ashwood Lane, past the last street lamp, past the old oak tree whose roots had long ago cracked the pavement into pieces. The garden was overgrown, ivy crawling up the stone walls, roses gone wild and dark, their thorns curling like fingers. The windows were tall and narrow, and at night, if you looked at them from the right angle, they seemed to hold the moonlight longer than they should. Nobody went near it. Nobody talked about it. Elena moved in next door on a Wednesday in October. She didn't sleep well in new places. This was something she had known about herself for years. The way unfamiliar ceilings made her restless. The way strange sounds kept her hovering at the edge of sleep without ever quite falling in. So at 2 a.m, when she heard the gate at the end of the lane open and close, she was already awake. She looked out of her bedroom window. A man was walking up the path to the empty house. Tall, dressed in dark clothes, moving with the kind of unhurried calm that belongs to people who have nowhere to be and all the time in the world to get there. He had a key. He used it. The door opened, and he stepped inside, and the house swallowed him whole. The lights never came on. She told herself it was nothing. A new tenant, a caretaker, someone the landlord had sent to check on the place. She made coffee and stood at her kitchen window and looked at the house in the gray morning light. Nothing moved. The curtains, heavy, dark, didn't stir. The garden was still. A single black bird sat on the gatepost, watching the lane with small, bright eyes. Elena watched back. She was still standing there when the bird flew away, and the clock on the wall said 8:30, and she realized she had been standing there for 40 minutes, and her coffee had gone completely cold. She saw him properly for the first time 3 days later. She was coming back from the shop, a bag of groceries in each hand, keys between her teeth, when she heard the gate again. She turned. He was standing at the end of his garden path, looking at her. He was younger than she had expected, or rather, he looked young, in the way that old paintings of young men look young. Perfectly, unnervingly, without a single line or shadow that time usually leaves behind. His hair was dark. His eyes, even from a distance, were very light. Gray or pale blue, she couldn't quite tell. He nodded once, slowly, the way people nod when they already know who you are. She nodded back. He went inside. That was all. That was enough to make her think about him for the rest of the day. On Saturday, she was in her own garden, trying to do something about the state of the flower bed, when she heard his gate open. She didn't look up immediately. She focused on the soil, on the trowel in her hand, on the specific task of loosening the earth around the roots of something that might have once been a lavender plant. "You're fighting a losing battle," said a voice. She looked up. He was standing at the low wall between their gardens, looking down at her with an expression that was almost, not quite, amused. "The lavender," he said. "It wants to spread. You can't contain it. You can only decide where." "That's very philosophical," she said. "For gardening advice." The corner of his mouth moved. "I've had a long time to think about plants," he said. She sat back on her heels and looked at him properly. "I'm Elena." "I know," he said. "I'm Lucian." "How do you know my name?" He considered this for a moment, the way someone considers a question they have been expecting. "Small lane," he said simply. "People talk." She wanted to point out that she had been here less than a week and had spoken to precisely no one. But something about the way he said it, quiet, certain, as if it were obviously true, made her let it go. "How long have you lived here?" she asked instead. A pause, longer than it needed to be. Longer than most, he said. It rained that evening. A slow, steady autumn rain that turned the lane into a mirror and made the street lamp's reflection wobble on the wet pavement. Elena made soup and sat by her window and watched the rain and thought about Lucian in a way she couldn't quite justify. There was nothing remarkable about him, she told herself. A quiet neighbor, a private person, nothing unusual, except the way he moved, which was too smooth, except the way he looked at her, which was too knowing, except the lights, which never came on in his house, not even now, in the dark and the rain. She fell asleep in the chair by the window, and she dreamed of a garden full of dark roses and a man standing very still at the center of it, watching her the way the moon watches the sea. Constant, patient, ancient. When she woke, it was past midnight. The rain had stopped, and on the wall between their gardens, perfectly dry despite the weather, sat a single dark rose. She hadn't heard him leave it. She hadn't heard anything at all. She left the rose on the windowsill. She told herself it was because she didn't know what else to do with it, not because it was beautiful, not because it smelled faintly of something she couldn't name, not quite earth, not quite smoke, not quite sweetness, something older than any of those things. In the morning it was still perfectly open. Not a single petal had fallen. She had cut roses before. She knew how they behaved. By morning they were always slightly less than they had been, edges softening, heads beginning their slow bow toward the inevitable. This one looked as though it had just been cut, as though time, in its immediate vicinity, had simply decided not to apply. She left it there for a week. It never changed. She knocked on his door on a Tuesday afternoon, which surprised her, because she hadn't decided to do it until she was already standing there with her hand raised. He opened the door before she knocked a second time, as though he had been expecting her, as though he had been standing just on the other side, waiting. "The rose," she said. "Thank you." "You're welcome," he said. And then, after a pause that felt carefully measured, "Would you like to come in?" The hallway was dark and cool, even for October. The walls were lined with books, old ones, their spines faded to colors that no longer had names. There were no photographs, no signs of ordinary life, no shoes by the door, no coats on the hooks, no smell of cooking or coffee, or any of the things that houses usually smell of. It smelled of old wood and candle wax, and that same indefinable something that the rose had carried. He led her to a sitting room where 2 chairs faced a fireplace. The fire was already lit. She wondered when he had started it. "Tea?" he asked. "Please," she said. He brought it in a cup she was fairly certain was older than her grandmother. He sat across from her and folded his hands in his lap and watched her drink with the quiet attention of someone observing something rare. "You don't have one," she said, nodding at her cup. "I don't drink tea," he said. "Coffee?" "No." "What do you drink?" The fire shifted. A log settled. Lucien looked at her steadily, and the firelight moved across his face in a way that made him look, for just a moment, like something painted rather than real. "Not tea," he said quietly, and almost smiled. She stayed for an hour, maybe longer. She lost track of time in that room in a way she never usually did. They talked about the lane, about the history of the houses, about the oak tree whose roots kept breaking the pavement. He knew things about the neighborhood that no one who had moved in recently could have known. Small things. The name of the family who had lived 3 doors down 40 years ago. The year the old post office had closed. The winter the lane had flooded, and the water had come up to the garden walls. "How do you know all of this?" she asked. "I read a great deal," he said. "Local history?" "Among other things." She looked at the books lining the walls. Some of them had no titles on their spines at all. Some of the titles were in languages she didn't recognize. "How long have you actually lived here?" she asked. Not the vague answer, the real one. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the overgrown garden, and the rose bushes made a soft sound against the window glass. "Long enough," he said, "that the honest answer would alarm you." "Try me," she said. He looked at her. Really looked. The way he had from across the garden wall. Unhurried. Careful. As though he were reading something written very small. "Not yet," he said. "Ask me again when you already know the answer." Walking home, 8 steps, which was all it took, she made a list in her head of the things she had noticed. He had not eaten or drunk anything. He had sat entirely still for the entire hour, with the particular stillness of something that did not need to shift its weight, or clear its throat, or fidget the way living things fidget. The fire had not made him warm. She had watched his face and seen no flush, no loosening of the careful composure that he wore like a second skin. His hands, when he had handed her the cup, had been very cold. She had felt it through the ceramic. And his eyes. She had finally seen them clearly in the firelight. They were gray. A very pale, very old gray. Like winter sky over water. Like ash. Like something that had once been another color entirely, and had simply run out of it over time. She stood in her own kitchen and looked at the rose on the windowsill. Still perfect. Still open. Still refusing to fade. She thought about what he had said. "Ask me again when you already know the answer." She was beginning, quietly and without wanting to be, to think she already did. That night she dreamed of the garden again. She was walking through it. The roses taller than she was, their dark blooms brushing her shoulders as she passed. The sky above was moonless, but full of stars. More stars than she had ever seen, as though the usual sky had been replaced with something older and more honest. Lucian was ahead of her on the path. She followed, not because she decided to, but because it seemed like the only direction that made sense. He stopped and turned, and in the dream his eyes were not gray, but silver, lit from within, like the stars above them, like something that had never needed the sun. "You already know," he said, dream quiet, certain. "Yes," she said. "And?" She looked at him, at the stillness of him, at the ancientness of him, at the way the starlight settled on him like it recognized him. "And I came back anyway," she said. He said nothing, but something in his expression shifted, something careful and long-held loosening, just slightly, like a door that had been locked for a very long time, hearing, at last, the right key. She woke to pale morning light and the sound of birds and the rose on her windowsill, still perfect, still open, still waiting. She went back on a Thursday. No reason, no excuse prepared. She simply walked the 8 steps and knocked, and he opened the door and stepped aside without a word, as though her coming back had always been part of some arrangement they had made long before she arrived on Ashwood Lane. The fire was already lit, the same 2 chairs, the same cool candle wax and old wood quiet. He sat, and she sat, and for a while neither of them spoke, and it was strange, she thought. How comfortable that was. How the silence in that room felt nothing like absence. It felt like presence, like something full. "I've been thinking," she said finally. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "You can't actually know that." "No," he agreed. "But I do." The fire shifted. Outside, the wind moved through the roses. "I want you to tell me," she said, "what you are. The real answer." He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she thought he might simply refuse, change the subject, deflect, give her another careful, almost answer that explained nothing and somehow said everything. Instead, he looked at the fire. "You already know," he said. "You said so yourself, in the dream." She went very still. "That was a dream," she said carefully. "Yes," he said. "And no." He turned to look at her then, and in the firelight his eyes were exactly as they had been in the dream, that deep, still, ancient gray, lit with something she had no name for. "Ask me," he said quietly. Out loud. The word. She took a breath. "Are you a vampire?" The word sat between them in the firelit room. Outside, the wind stopped entirely, as though the night itself had paused to listen. "Yes," he said, simply, quietly, without apology or drama or any of the weight she had expected the word to carry. Just, yes. She had imagined, in the abstract way you imagine things you don't quite believe, that she would feel afraid, that something animal and ancient in her would recognize the danger and respond to it, heart racing, hands cold, every instinct pointing toward the door. Instead, she felt still, the same fullness the silence had carried, settling deeper. "How long?" she asked. "A very long time," he said. And then, after a pause, 341 years. "Since when?" "Since I was 26. He looked at the fire. "I have been 26 for 341 years. She thought about that. About what it meant to have a number that large attached to something as ordinary as an age. About all the winters that number contained, all the lanes and houses and fires, all the people who had come and gone while he remained, still and unchanging, at the end of Ashwood Lane. "Are you lonely?" she asked. She hadn't meant to. It came out the way true things sometimes do, before the careful part of her could stop it. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at his hands, folded in his lap, and something moved across his face, old and quiet and enormous, like weather over open water. "I was," he said. "For a very long time, I was." "And now?" He looked up at her. "Now," he said, "you are here." "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Being what you are?" "Not in the way you mean," he said. "There is no pain in it. Only weight. The weight of time. The weight of watching things end that you cannot hold on to." "People," she said softly. "People," he agreed. His voice was very quiet. "You love them, and they are mortal, and eventually, always, you are standing at a grave that is too small for everything you feel." The fire burned low. She didn't move to leave. "And yet you let me knock on your door," she said. "You left the rose. You let me in." A long silence. The longest yet. "Yes," he said finally, so quietly she almost didn't hear it. "I did." "Why?" He looked at her with those 300-year-old eyes and said nothing for a moment that stretched like something being very carefully handled. "Because," he said at last, "some things are worth the wait." She left when the fire had burned down to embers. 8 steps home. The lane was quiet and cold and full of stars. She stopped halfway and looked up at them. More stars than usual, she thought. Or maybe she was simply looking harder than usual. And breathed the night air and felt something she couldn't name settle into place inside her chest. Behind her, she heard his door close softly. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel him there the way you feel a fire after you've left the room. The warmth of it still present, still real, still meaning something in the cold. She went inside. She made tea she actually drank this time. She sat by the window and looked at the rose, still perfect on the sill, and thought about 341 years and what it might feel like to carry that much time and still choose, carefully, quietly, to let someone in. She fell asleep in the chair again. She dreamed of stars. It became a habit, the way habits do, gradually, and then all at once. Tuesday, she brought him a book she thought he might not have read. He had, of course. He had read most things, across most centuries, but he took it from her with both hands and turned it over slowly, the way you handle something given with care, and said thank you in a way that meant more than the words. Thursday, she stayed until the church clock down the road struck 10. Friday, she lost track of time entirely and looked up to find it was past midnight and the lane outside was completely silent, and she felt no particular urgency to move. He never asked her to stay. He never asked her to go. He simply made room for her, quietly, the way old houses make room for the people who belong in them. On a Saturday in November, he showed her the rest of the house. She had only ever seen the sitting room and the hallway. The rest had existed as a kind of abstraction. Closed doors, other rooms, the particular silence of spaces she hadn't entered. Now he led her down the hall and through a door she hadn't noticed before, and she stopped in the doorway and simply looked. The room was a library. Floor to ceiling, every wall. Books so old some of them had no covers left, only bare boards and thread. Books in Latin and French and languages she couldn't identify. Maps in glass frames. A large wooden desk with nothing on it but a single candle, burned almost to the end. "How many?" she asked. "I stopped counting," he said. "Somewhere around 4,000. She walked slowly along one wall, trailing her fingers near the spines without quite touching. The oldest ones felt different even from a distance. Something in the air around them, something dense and particular, like the smell before rain. "Did you read all of them?" "Most," he said. "Some I keep for other reasons." "What other reasons?" He moved to a shelf near the window and touched the spine of a very thin volume, bound in dark cloth. "Because someone I loved gave it to me," he said, simply, without looking at her. "In 1743, and I have never been able to put it down." She looked at his hand on the spine of the book, perfectly still, as always, and felt something ache quietly in her chest. It happened near the end of the evening. They had moved back to the sitting room. The fire was high and warm, and she had curled into the chair the way she had started to do, feet tucked under her, the particular ease of a place that had become familiar. And he was reading aloud to her from something in Italian, translating as he went, his voice low and even and unhurried. She wasn't sure when she first noticed it. A sound from outside. The gate at the end of the lane, swinging in the wind. A high, thin creak that came and went. Nothing unusual, except that the moment it started, something changed in Lucien. He stopped mid-sentence. His head turned toward the window, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the absolute precision of something that does not need to think about where to look. His eyes, which had been warm in the firelight, shifted. Not color, the gray remained, but something behind them, something deeper, went very still and very alert in a way that had nothing to do with being human. He was listening. Not the way people listen, tilted head, furrowed brow, the conscious effort of paying attention. He was listening the way animals listen, the way old things listen. Every part of him perfectly oriented toward the sound, processing it in ways she had no access to, reaching out into the dark beyond the window with senses she didn't have. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then the gate stopped creaking, and he turned back, and his eyes were warm again, and he found his place on the page as though nothing had happened. "Just the wind," he said quietly. "I know," she said, but her heart was beating slightly faster. Not from fear. She examined the feeling carefully and found no fear in it. From something else. From the reminder, vivid and sudden, of exactly what she was sitting across the fire from. Not a quiet neighbor. Not a private man. Something ancient and precise and extraordinary that had chosen, for reasons she was still learning, to spend its evenings reading Italian poetry to her by firelight. He walked her to her door that night. 8 steps had never felt so long or so short. The lane was cold and very still, the stars sharp and close the way they get in November, when the air has no warmth left to blur them. At her door she turned and looked at him. He was standing very correctly, very still, hands at his sides, looking at her with that expression she had come to know, careful and old, and full of something he hadn't yet found the words for, or perhaps had simply not yet decided to say. "Thank you," she said, "for the library, for the reading." "Thank you," he said, "for staying." A beat of silence. The kind that has a shape. "Lucien," she said, "what you said earlier, about the weight of watching things end." He waited. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, "for whatever that's worth. Right now, I'm not going anywhere." Something moved in his face. That door again, the one she had seen in the dream, opening a little further, a little more light coming through. "It's worth a great deal," he said softly. "More than you know." She went inside. She stood in her hallway and listened to his footsteps. 8 steps, unhurried, certain, and the soft close of his door. The rose on her windowsill had finally, that morning, opened one more petal than before. She noticed it now, and smiled, and went to bed, and slept without dreaming, which was, she thought, its own kind of peace.